Is it really about humans versus machines, or is it humans plus machines? Because everything depends on the lens we apply. I think it's quite common to think of artificial intelligence and machine intelligence as something that will eventually replace human beings, especially in the world of research. But as I will show you in this talk, our approach to machine intelligence is a bit different in the sense that we're looking at machine intelligence as a value add, not just to research in terms of the output and the speed and agility of getting there, but also in terms of the sheer superpowers it gives researchers in terms of their abilities to do better work, especially in observational ethnography, and in terms of improving the actual joy or the experience of doing that work. Does anyone remember what it was like to go to a foreign land and navigate oneself through tourist hotspots with an old school paper map? Doesn't it feel like it was so long ago? It's incredible how the experience of travel has completely transformed thanks to Google Maps, for example. Because otherwise you'd be like juggling around your map trying to find the right places. You'd invariably get frustrated. You would certainly not be able to find all the places you wanted to go to. And you'd certainly feel like you've left something on the table. And that experience has now been completely transformed thanks to Google Maps, because you put your earphone in your ear and basically directs you exactly to where you want to go, finds you all the hotspots, links to your interests, and so on and so forth. And we believe the same is possible now in the field of ethnography and observational ethnography in particular, because the old method of observational ethnography is kind of like having that map and you're kind of twisting it around to figure yourself out and orient yourself in a foreign land. In the case of ethnography, you're orienting yourself in a foreign culture. You're trying to figure out what the norms and the meanings are that are pervasive in that culture that you're studying. But it's impossible to know if you're going in the right direction. It's impossible to know when you reach the end. And it invariably leaves you with this feeling that you have left something on the table, that you haven't truly understood everything or the most important things that need to be understood about that particular culture. And that's exactly what we're trying to change with machine intelligence in the field of ethnography, where we believe we can use the breadcrumbs left by the consumer, the meanings, the breadcrumbs of meaning left by the consumer, kind of like the assistant in your ear telling you where to go next, what to explore next, eventually bringing you to the end of that journey and giving you, sort of all the inputs necessary, all the ingredients necessary to truly understand and make sense of that culture. When we started our company 5 years back, we really wanted to bring true observational ethnography back to corporate research, because we found that ethnography had gotten watered down pretty significantly in the corporate world. I mean, what we call ethnography usually is a bunch of qualitative interviews, maybe a little bit of home visits. Of course, in the COVID environment, that's gone out the window as well. But ethnography has gotten watered down, and we really wanted to bring the art and science of true observational ethnography back to the equation, because the real purpose of observational ethnography is the study of meaning. What do I mean by that? Well, meaning is communicated inadvertently, organically, naturally, when we use words to describe and try to understand and make sense of topics. So let's say, for example, you're studying the culture of dairy intolerance. And let's say it's immersive research. You're spending some time hanging out with some people who believe that they're intolerant to dairy. Now, as these people talk about and describe, why they believe what they believe, and they try to understand what's going on in their own intolerance, they're using words and language to do that. And all those words carry meaning. So for example, one set of meanings might revolve around a whole bunch of discussion about how one's body feels after the consumption of dairy. Maybe you feel bloated, maybe you feel lethargic. Another set of meanings could revolve around maybe it's about how one's skin looks. So, there could be discussions about whether people believe they somehow break out when they consume dairy. Another set of meanings could revolve around weight loss. But how do you get at these meanings? You get at these meanings by decoding the patterns in the words people use when they describe and try to understand and make sense of their intolerance with dairy. And that's really the greatest power of observational ethnography, is to get to these meanings, and in particular, the implicit meanings that underline a particular culture, a particular topic. And that's exactly what I learned to do when I started my first job at a school. I got to follow around a group of amateur wildlife photographers from one sanctuary to another, and follow them around while they took photos. I was studying that culture of wildlife photography. And my supervisor and I, at the end of a 4-month-long project, ended up with hundreds of pages of notes, hundreds of hours of audio recording. The sheer amount of data was overwhelming. But worst of all was the process of going through all of it at the end. Not only was there severe fatigue in trying to sort through and organize the data, but we also couldn't help but feel like our own cognitive biases were affecting how we categorize certain sets of meanings as being more important than others. And through the process, there was a bit of a loss of joy through the entire process. And that was kind of sad, considering what an incredible experience that had been, especially for me right out of school. At one point, by the way, I was 8 feet away from a tiger, a Bengal tiger, while photos were being taken. It was such an incredible experience. And yet there was a loss of joy. And that's exactly what we set out to solve when we started our company. Because of course, what was interesting about the modern world and the modern context was that we now had the ability to, I didn't need to follow around 20 wildlife photographers anymore and spend 4 months in field and hundreds of thousands of dollars. I could now get all this data in an instant. Instead of worrying about 20 people, I could get data from hundreds of thousands, if not millions of consumers who are sharing and bearing their souls on the internet every single day. And I had this incredible richness in data source. So clearly, there was a completely different universe of data available. But the problem I was really trying to solve, that I had in the back of my mind, was how could the access to big data plus the access to some of these machine intelligent tools, how could I marry the two in a way to solve the 3 problems I highlighted before? Problems around cognitive biases, problems around fatigue, researcher fatigue, and ultimately problems around joy. And that's really what we set out to do here. In trying to create a framework much similar to the framework of Google Maps replacing traditional maps. What we were really trying to understand is, with this sheer access to big data in the form of these millions and millions of conversations pretty much on any and every topic, we now had the ability to look at the broader context of discussions happening around a topic that mattered to us. Any trend, any topic. We had the ability to look at the broader context of discussions, and doing so opened the door potentially to be able to create some sort of a mapping system of our own. And to do that, we went back to the underlying purpose of observational ethnography, which is the study of meaning. Now, meaning, of course, comes from studying the words that consumers inadvertently, organically use when they're describing or trying to understand a particular topic. So to figure out how we could create a map of meaning, we went back to study the structure of how meanings are created or formed in the first place around topics of interest. So let's look at an example of exactly that. On your screen, you're seeing a simplified example of the meanings or the words that people use to describe or try to make sense of gut health. Now, when we studied these types of systems, we learned a few interesting things. First of all, when you look at the broader context of discussions around gut health, you'll find that there are a whole host of words used to understand and describe gut health by consumers. And because you're getting such an incredible volume of data, you can actually quantitatively organize the nature of the relationship between these words and the underlying topic of gut health. So for example, certain words like immune function may be directly connected to gut health just because it's directly associated with gut health, just through language, through the way people talk about gut health and immune function. And it's close semantically to gut health because it's talked about more often and more people talk about it, and therefore it's more closely related than, let's say, a topic like mood, which is a little further away in its semantic relationship because it's talked about indirectly, but still in the broader context of gut health, and it's not talked about as often and not by as many people. So we found that the big data that we got in the form of the millions of consumer conversations on the internet, it gave us certain abilities to actually create a map of meaning around pretty much any topic that people discuss on the internet. Now, because we could create this map of meaning, the next question became, okay, so if we have this map, then could this map basically function kind of like, Google Assistant in your ear telling you exactly where to go next? And in order to do that, we discovered that every single one of these topics had to give us the ability to basically figure out what the relationship was between immune function and gut health. So for example, every node on this map needed to serve like a breadcrumb, so that as a researcher, this would be my map, and all I had to do was click on these points of interest and explore and figure out exactly what the relationship is in the consumer's mind between the brain axis and gut health, or between mood and gut health, and so on and so forth. And that really set us on this path of realization, trying to build a system that would function sort of like the Google Maps version of modern observational ethnography. And this is basically what it ended up looking like. So this is a screenshot that I took yesterday from our technology MotivBase on the topic of gut health. And what you'll see is a set of related topics, or a set of related words that people are using in the broader context of conversations around gut health in order to make sense of gut health. And these topics are basically breadcrumbs for my research team, for our anthropologists. It's kind of like the points of interest on our meaning map. And so we've built that now, where every point of interest is an opportunity for us to double click and figure out what the relationship is. So for example, my researcher can now double click on food sensitivity and figure out, why does food sensitivity come up in the context of gut health? They can then figure out something like vitamin deficiency or digestion issues. Again, figure out, what does it mean in the context of gut health? So we now have a map. So first of all, we now have a system where we no longer have to create this map. We no longer have to juggle it around. We no longer have to sort the data, organize the data. Instead, we just have to focus on exploring the different points of interest and experiencing them, understanding their relationship to the underlying topic in question, and building our narrative out. How amazing is that? So we suddenly found ourselves faced with a system that not only avoided fatigue, because we didn't have to wade through hundreds and hundreds of hours of data or try to sort it all out and make sense of it all in our heads, but we also had landed on a system that minimized cognitive biases, because we were not relying on our brain to figure out what was more or less important, which meanings were more or less important. We could rely on the consumer to tell us which meanings are more or less important, kind of like how Google might rely on its rating system to tell you which restaurant is more or less relevant to you. It's kind of the same way, where we're relying on the language consumers use organically, inadvertently, over time around a topic like gut health, to then figure out what meanings are more or less important to them. So, for example, you might see meanings here around the food intake, meanings around micronutrients and nutrition, meanings around fermentation or certain types of foods. There's meanings around changing one's diet, and so on and so forth. There's a reason why these meanings all exist the way they do in this map, and it's all thanks to the consumer basically laying it all out for us to then explore and in essence play a game with. Which basically ended up creating a system where now we could use the machine to do a lot of the tasks that we hated to do as anthropologists. So the machine could take care of all these tasks right up to here: the data collection, the organization of the data, the sorting and the filtering of the data, making sure that we minimize the cognitive biases. Now I'm going to take this one step further. Now we also realize that as we continue to build our AI systems and as we get more and more sophisticated in our systems, this line also starts to move a little bit further. And so now currently this line sits here because now our machine also does some of the basic front-end interpretation as well. So net, the process is that it gives us as researchers the ability to take all the unnecessary tasks out of our brains and focus our brains on the best part of the ethnography, which is the true interpretation and narrative building, to really get at the most critical insights and then figure out what's most relevant to a particular project or particular client and so on. And along the way, we get to push the ability of the machine to help us in that interpretation journey as well. So just thinking back to the previous slide where I talked about how we've been able to push the machine to do a little bit more of the interpretation work, these are just some examples from our system of what we've been able to do. And I'm sure many other organizations are doing similar things. For example, our machine can now take our map of meaning and quantify it. So we can actually tell you, okay, gut health as a culture is relevant to 34 million Americans today. There's a 40%-ish growth in that culture. It has a relative maturity of about 17.8%. So basically 17% of this culture really understands the purpose and the value of gut health consistently. We can also tell you what the ethnographic DNA is of that culture. So what kinds of motivations and attitudes and fears and value systems drive the consumer in that culture. And all these results, by the way, appear in about 7 seconds of data crunching in our system. So it's live and it's on demand. You just search gut health and you get all these results. But this is just an example of how we've been able to not just use the machine for the data collection and the sorting and the organization, but also push the limits in terms of some of the front-end interpretation work that the machine can now do. And it now aids our research team, our anthropologists, to then also do more work on the back end in terms of interpreting the data, understanding and making sense of the meanings, and then obviously helping our clients make sense of it as well. And the result is that we have ended up with a system that lets our researchers basically play a language game in sort of the Wittgensteinian sense for those of you who are philosophy buffs. It allows our researchers to play a language game. We are now placed, there's sort of a map of meaning placed before us, and our job is to now discover the relationships by exploring each of the breadcrumbs that the consumer has left for us in any particular context. So our researchers are basically playing a language game to make sense of the meanings, group them into themes of meaning, and write a narrative out of it. And so the last part very much comes into the equation as well. Not only have we avoided fatigue, minimized cognitive biases, but we've also brought back the sheer joy of research because our researchers get to do the best part of the ethnographic process, which is the interpretation, making sense of it, and then building a narrative out of it. And of course, exciting our clients out of the work. So let me give you a few examples of the application of this type of a mapping system. So in a couple of minutes of running an analysis, for example, I can tell you that there's an incredible relationship now that is deepening and strengthening between facial skin health and hair health. So much so that in the broader personal care landscape, the connection between skin and hair health offers the greatest opportunity for growth for companies in the next 12 to 24 months. This is another example in the area of sustainability. Again, in a couple of minutes of research using the tool and following some of the breadcrumbs, we can quickly see that in the area of sustainability, the greatest opportunities emerging is not in packaging or in the use of PCR plastics or so on and so forth. It's actually in helping consumers make more conscious decisions. People actually want to consume less. They want to think more about the types of products they buy, how long those products will last, what they're made out of. Overall, the greatest opportunity emerging in this space is of an increasingly conscious consumer who is paying attention to the types of decisions they make and the purpose of those decisions. As fun as it is to play this language game of interpretation, following the consumer's breadcrumbs, we're also constantly trying to find ways to push the boundary on the interpretation side as well. So what you're seeing in front of you is our machine actually doing a little bit of the thematic interpretation around gut health and saying, hey, there's a grouping or a theme of meaning developing around mood, and it has something to do with the brain axis and it's linked to gut health. So that's really interesting. Obviously, these are some of our more experimental features, but as I mentioned earlier, we're constantly trying to push that line, if you remember, in terms of how far can the AI engine go in the interpretation. Again, the purpose isn't to have the human being do less. The purpose is to push the end line or the end zone further out, to have the human being do more, to deliver greater outcomes through the research process, and to allow us to extract more and more value as we go along. Which brings us back to the ultimate reason for doing this presentation in the first place. Instead of being replaced by AI, I think all of us need to be focused on, and I think we are, but I think the power, especially over the next decade, of the application of artificial intelligence and machine tools is really to help make research better by helping researchers be better at their jobs, and by also using these tools to make the joy of work better as well. I think both work hand in hand. It's not enough to just make something more efficient or make something faster or make something more in-depth in terms of the capabilities. I think it's also relevant and critical to also figure out how the joy, the sheer experience of research itself can be elevated using the new and emerging tools and techniques available to us. And that's exactly our purpose as an organization. That's why we wake up every morning, we get excited to do what we do, and of course we get to push the boundary of what we're able to deliver to our clients. Thank you for joining me today. My email address is on your screen. I'll now take questions. If any of you would like to reach out to me, please feel free to do so.